In the summer of 1968, a series of images taken during a routine military exercise on the outskirts of Nevada were archived, processed, and immediately deleted. Not by mistake, not by accident, but by direct order. The photos had recorded something that wasn't part of the training, that wasn't part of the mission, and which, according to everyone involved, was not part of this world. In July 1968, the US Army began a 6-day medium-scale training operation called Iron Line, which was carried out entirely in the Nevada desert, close to the area known as Sector 11, a strip of land that was poorly mapped in civilian records. The mission was simple on paper: to train maneuvers in uneven terrain with a focus on radio communication and visual coordination between ground platoons and air units. A total of 174 men took part, divided into 4 companies, as well as technical support from radar and film operators and 2 transport helicopters. The images captured during the training sessions were to be used in internal strategic analysis sessions, as was always the case. What nobody expected, however, was that some of this material would never be handed over, not to the command or to the archive, and that none of the images labeled Lot 17 would appear in the final records. For years, the only people who knew what had been seen in those frames were the cameramen, 2 intelligence officers, and a colonel with the surname Satterfield, who died 3 months later in poorly explained circumstances. The case was officially sealed under the acronym INX Phantom and classified as visual interference of undetermined origin, but those who were there never forgot what they saw. The Iron Line support base was set up 78 kilometers from the nearest town, on a flat stretch of desert that had been used for radio tests since the 50s. The site offered wide visibility, stable ground, and an almost total absence of urban interference. The heat was extreme, and the dry air caused the horizon to shake at every angle, creating constant mirages that confused less experienced operators. The camp consisted of operational tents, radio towers, a mobile command center, and a visual documentation unit. There, analog cameras were loaded, positioned and changed by technicians working in rotation. Photographic recording was an essential part of the training. Each maneuver had to be captured by at least 2 fixed angles and a mobile camera operated by a helicopter crew member. Until then, it was standard protocol. But on the 3rd day, something bothered the chief technician of the imaging unit. When he reviewed the sequences recorded by Camera 03, he noticed that some frames were marked as overlapping, even with new rolls. The images showed duplicates of silhouettes, men on the march appearing twice in the same frame with identical positions, but slightly out of sync. At first, they thought it was a fault with the lens. Then they noticed something even stranger. Some of these duplicated men were not among those present that day. The first record officially considered anomalous was captured at 4:41 p.m. on the 4th day of training. The fixed camera installed at the top of the North Tower recorded a sequence of 5 images at 10-second intervals. In the first 4, everything seemed normal. Soldiers marching, vehicles advancing in formation, no change. But in the 5th image, there was something in the sky, something still, something with no defined shape, but clearly present. It wasn't an aircraft, nor a bird, nor a defect in the lens. The object was suspended at an altitude of around 200 meters, just above the column on the left. It was dark in the center, translucent at the edges, with a soft glow at one end. But what was most striking was the absence of a shadow cast on the ground despite the position of the sun, as if that body wasn't there to interact with the light. The cameraman, a recruit called Malden, noticed the detail only hours later during the screening. When he showed the image to his supervisor, he received an instruction he had never heard before. Print this out in 3 copies, and then erase the original from the roll. But before obeying, he did something that would change the whole course of history. He kept one of the copies for himself. 2 days later, at 6:03 a.m., the unit responsible for capturing the film recorded another phenomenon. During the replay of a platoon march on the eastern flank, one of the reels revealed something imperceptible to the naked eye, a moving shadow projected onto the sandy terrain, but with no corresponding object in the frame. The shadow moved as if it were following someone, but no one was there. Attempts to slow down the film revealed a constant, curved movement at a slightly faster speed than the marching soldiers. The shadow passed between the men without being noticed by any of them. Not a single glance, no reaction. Just the mechanical record of the presence of something without a body, but with enough density to project form. The person in charge of image analysis, Sergeant Leland Foster, tried to report what had happened to the commanding officer, but received an unexpected reply. Keep filming. Don't interrupt. And if it appears again, don't react. The tone of his voice, cold and firm, indicated that this had been expected by someone. The first man to really understand what was in the images was the same one they had ignored for weeks. A civilian hired as a chemical development technician called James Rourke. He was a methodical, quiet man, known for speaking little and doing his work in silence. While developing the roles of the 6th Instruction March, he noticed an unusual stain on one of the films. It wasn't dirt. It wasn't damage. It was a subtle silhouette, standing between 2 rows of soldiers. The figure was translucent, but human in shape. It wasn't wearing a uniform or a helmet. Its arms were lowered and its head was slightly tilted. It was standing among the soldiers, but no one in the image reacted to its presence. It was as if they weren't seeing it, as if it wasn't at the right time in the photo. Rourke didn't take the case to his superiors. Instead, he enlarged the image manually, frame by frame, and saw something that made him step back from the table. The figure changed position between frames without moving its feet, as if it were a presence captured at different times, fragmented but centered in the same place. When he finally showed the sequence to another technician, he heard the following phrase, spoken in a whisper: "You shouldn't have revealed that. Not here." In the late afternoon of the 6th day, the command of Operation Iron Line issued an unusual order. All the photographic and cinematographic images taken between the 3rd and 6th had to be handed in personally to the internal security sector. The official justification was to check the positioning protocol, but none of the technicians believed it. For the first time since the beginning of the exercise, armed officers began to circulate among the documentation team's barracks. The collection was quick and straightforward. Sealed rolls, freshly unsealed reels, loose negatives. Everything was packed into metal cases and carried by men who were not part of the original operation. Their uniforms were too clean. Their names were absent. They wore no visible identification, and when asked, they answered only with numbers. Technician James Rourke tried to hide some of the material he had enlarged, but when he returned from lunch, his station was locked, and his name was crossed off the next day's list. One of the camera assistants, Private Buckley, reported that he saw 2 images being removed from inside the chemical fridge with thermal gloves, as if they posed a risk of direct contact. When he asked why, he heard from one of the men, "Those images weren't made with light, they were made with noise." The phrase didn't make sense at the time, but it proved to be more accurate than any technical explanation. The following morning, an emergency meeting was called in the Central Command tent. Only 5 people were present. The commander of the operation, 2 intelligence analysts newly arrived from Fort Carson, a radar technician, and Colonel Satterfield, recently transferred from the East Coast. The agenda for the meeting was not officially recorded, but witnesses outside heard fragments of the conversations, and the tone was tense. Among the snippets picked up by attentive ears were expressions such as extra-layer interference, white protocol, and change in photonic behavior, words that don't belong in the common vocabulary of tactical exercises. Colonel Satterfield, according to one of the guards, left the tent with a pale face and remained silent throughout the day. He was never seen giving direct orders after that meeting. The next morning, a new instruction was given verbally to the remaining cameramen. No lens was to be pointed at the sky for more than 5 seconds. No more panoramic images would be allowed. And if any figure or shape incompatible with troop positioning appeared again, the recommendation was simple: keep the record, do not reveal. The exercise would continue, but the operation had visibly changed purpose. On the 8th day of the operation, a 500-meter zone around the North Tower was cordoned off with containment tape. There was no explosion, no contamination, and no logistical risk identified. But no one was allowed in except two security officers, a technician with a suitcase of sensors, and Colonel Satterfield, who crossed the line at 3:47 p.m. and never spoke to anyone after that. When questioned, the guards said that the region showed an anomalous response to light and heat stimuli, which in theory doesn't make sense in a desert area. One of the soldiers who flew over the area in a helicopter noticed that the sand around the perimeter seemed darker than normal, as if it had absorbed radiation or undergone a process of partial vitrification. What no one could explain was what the colonel had taken with him, a handheld photographic projector, the kind used to enlarge negatives on matte paper. He went in with the equipment on his back and stayed there for almost 30 minutes. When he came out, he was alone, sweating and with trembling hands. He left the projector on the floor and just said, "It's not printed, it's waiting for the light to come on." After that, he never left his tent. On the 9th day, one of the mobile cameras, a Bell & Howell 70 with adapted military lenses, suffered unexplained internal damage. It had been positioned to capture the advance of a convoy over a dune, but on retrieving the reel, the technicians found the film completely blackened, not burned by heat, but marked as if it had been exposed to a localized heat wave. The inside of the camera was intact. Even stranger was the sound recorded by the film's optical track, a sequence of low pulsations similar to slowed beats. When the audio analysts played back the track at low speed, they identified something that shouldn't have been there, a sound like a human voice, but slurred and without clear vocalization. It was like a language being forced through a filter that didn't recognize it. After listening for 30 seconds, the sound technician removed the headphones with trembling hands and said, "That's not recorded. It's waiting for someone to hear it." The camera was sealed, and the report on the episode, stamped with the utmost secrecy, was given an acronym that no one could decipher: NIDH. They later found out noise-induced distortion, humanized. With the operation about to end, the command decided to carry out one last test, to reconstruct, with precision, the scene where the first visual object appeared. They used the same positions, the same time, and even the same gear. The cameras were repositioned exactly as they were on the 4th day, and the soldiers were instructed to repeat the steps perfectly. The first image was captured at 16:43, the second at 16:45, but when they were revealed, something appeared again. Not the original figure, not the moving shadow, but a gap in the sky, as if the blue had been cut out, folded slightly, and glued back together the wrong way. An unevenness in the texture of space, visible only in the background of the image. When enlarged, it showed a slight curvature on the horizon, as if the sky had moved. The photographer in charge, an Air Force civilian who was assisting the mission, said that it wasn't a defect, not an optical illusion, not even a lens bend. He said, "It's not what's in the image, it's what she missed for seconds." The reenactment was closed. The reel was archived under a triple seal, but behind the scenes, a certainty was beginning to form. The images weren't just recording the phenomenon, they were becoming part of it. On the 10th day of the operation, one of the ground photographers captured a sequence of images in which an intense light appeared at the bottom of the frame between two rock formations. Initially, it was thought to be a solar reflection or exposure failure, but on closer inspection, they realized something impossible. The light wasn't casting a shadow on any of the surrounding objects. What's worse, none of the soldiers present saw the light live. The photos were examined with a portable spectrometer, revealing levels of refraction incompatible with any known source. The intensity of the light was measured, but there was no point of origin. It simply existed within the image and moved between frames, as if it were moving in sequence, following the clicks. When they realized this, the technicians tried to digitally erase the light in processed copies, but every time the area was edited, black spots appeared elsewhere in the photo, forming undefined, almost symmetrical figures, as if the light was defending its own presence. One of the experts uttered a phrase that left the room in silence. "It's not a reflection, it's a response." In the analysis of images of the moving platoons, another anomalous pattern emerged. Certain soldiers appeared with incorrect postures. Knees bent too much, arms stiff, body leaning out of line with doctrine, in just a few frames. When they reappeared in subsequent images, they were normal. But when they were compared with the audio recordings, it was discovered that these faulty frames coincided with moments of radio interference. The phenomenon was observed in more than a dozen photos, and it wasn't just deformation of the film. It was movement outside of human physics. One of the pictures showed a man turned 90 degrees while his foot remained flat on the ground. The angles of articulation were impossible. There was no blur, no shaking. It was a perfectly clear image of something that couldn't happen. When one of the officers tried to justify it as an optical error, a photographer replied coldly, "It could be a mistake, but not ours. It could be the mistake of what was trying to look like them." On the 11th day, 3 soldiers reported sudden dizziness while patrolling in a straight line. They said that the ground seemed to move under their feet, even though it was stable. One of them said that the air became as thick as water when he looked directly at the point where the observation tower had been set up a few days earlier. No tests identified hallucinogenic substances or weather interference. One of the base doctors suggested heat stress, until a 4th witness, a sergeant from the support team, said that as he passed near the tower, he saw something in the distance. It was a figure, straight, immobile, with skin too white, and when he tried to get closer, the image flashed, like a screen malfunction, and disappeared. There was no alarm. No superior responded to the report. The medical officer then proposed what he called a reflective psychological barrier, a zone of induced visual influence. But no one wanted to hear any explanations. One of the soldiers, when asked why he avoided passing by the site, simply replied, "Because I saw myself there, standing there, looking at me, before I arrived." On the penultimate day, one of the support helicopters suddenly lost altitude, even in stable weather conditions. The pilot managed to stabilize the aircraft, but on returning to base, he reported that the panel began to oscillate as soon as they passed over the image shed area. The lights flashed, the altimeter went to 0, and for about 5 seconds he felt that the helicopter was still in the air, but the world around it was still moving. The onboard instruments didn't register a fault, but when the co-pilot reviewed the images captured by the external camera, he noticed that some of the shadows cast on the ground were delayed, as if the light was trying to keep up with the movement, but at a different pace. One of the engineers called the phenomenon atmospheric photonic delay, which sounded more like an excuse than a theory. The pilot refused to fly over that area again. His sentence was direct. The aircraft was in the air, but the space below was no longer the same. The roll of film identified as Lot 17 was never officially archived. It was made up of images taken manually by a field photographer on the 5th and 6th. The photos were developed, viewed by just 3 people, and then sealed in a black case. What was there has never been described in a public document, but according to reports from those who had access, it wasn't just exercise photos. One of the pictures in particular showed a kind of tear in the sky, a narrow slit with diagonal lines that didn't belong to cloud formation or any natural phenomenon. The light around the crack seemed darker than the normal shadow, and, according to the verbal report of one of the analysts, there was a second landscape emerging from behind the main one. The roll was classified as contaminated, which nobody understood. But in an off-the-record interview years later, one of the technicians let slip a phrase that has never left the hidden archives. Roll 17 didn't record an image. It recorded the interval between 2 realities. 2 days after the official end of the mission, a small scanning team was sent to the site to dismantle the temporary base. Upon inspecting the area near the North Tower, where most of the visual anomalies had been recorded, the soldiers found deep marks in the ground in a circular pattern. They were symmetrical, 3 meters in diameter, and seemed to have been made by constant pressure, not by digging or machinery. The marks were not there during training. They appear in previous records as flat, untouched ground. The surrounding sand was vitrified in isolated spots, as if it had been heated internally by micropulses. When one of the men tried to remove a sample from the center of the circle, the soil cracked, giving off an intense metallic smell. The final report only mentioned natural thermal transformations due to prolonged exposure to the sun. But one of the team's civil engineers wrote by hand on the back of the report, "Sun doesn't do that, nor heat. That was weight of presence." To this day, the marks are still visible on aerial images of the region, but they have been erased from official maps. In an attempt to digitize part of the negatives for future cataloging, Air Force technicians noticed an unprecedented phenomenon. Low-frequency noise was picked up during the digitization of certain frames. The scanners registered sounds, even though they were machines designed only for images. The noise was constant, soft, but full of pattern. Curious, the technicians attached a spectrum amplifier and discovered that the sounds formed rhythmic pulses at intervals of 0.8 seconds. When they converted the sequence into audible sound waves, they heard something similar to filtered breathing, accompanied by regular clicks. The most shocking thing, each negative with audio had a direct link to one of the images marked as sensitive. In a test attempt, one of the pictures was played back in a dark room, accompanied by the sound frequency generated. The experiment lasted exactly 42 seconds. Afterwards, the operator left the room in a state of stupor and remained silent for 4 days. When he finally spoke, he said, "The image is still looking. I was just her flash." During the chemical development of one of the last negatives from Roll 17, an unusual phenomenon occurred. The image simply didn't appear. The paper reacted to the solution, the fixative bath worked, but the developed surface remained blank, as if the light had passed through the film without impressing it. It was impossible, but it was there. After several attempts, the lab technician decided to leave the paper developing for longer to try to force it into some shape. It was then that something even stranger happened. A silhouette began to appear, slowly, as if it was refusing to be printed. But it wasn't in the center of the image. It was on the edge of the border, as if it were observing the scene from outside. When the image finally fixed, the surrounding details were blurred, but the figure on the edge remained sharp. There was no face. It had no shadow, and it seemed to be leaning towards the viewer. The technician left the lab that night and never came back. He left only one sentence scribbled on his notepad. "It's not what you photograph. It's what sees you while you photograph." The paper was sealed under the designation O negative. A lieutenant from the intelligence team, trying to understand the events without direct authorization, removed one of the sensitive images from the sealed box and took home a copy made by direct contact without registration. The intention was simple: to study calmly outside the controlled environment. But 3 days later, he called the command for urgent psychiatric care. According to his own account, after framing the copy and leaving it in his office, he began to feel a presence in the room. Even though he was alone, the air seemed denser. The mirrors in the house began to condense for no reason. The telephone rang without any calls. But the worst was when one morning he woke up to the frame lying on the floor and the image partially burnt from the inside out. When he was admitted to hospital, he kept saying, "She's trying to get out. She's looking for another lens, another eye." The painting was collected and the rest of the material destroyed. But the original copy has disappeared from the archive. Nobody knows where it is or who is looking at it now. At the end of the operation, 5 negatives considered structurally unstable were sealed in magnetic containers and stored in an underground Air Force facility, each in an insulated envelope with red labels and the instruction, "Do not handle under continuous light." This warning was never explained, but it was respected to the letter. Over time, some technicians began to notice that the contours in the images seemed to change slightly over the years. It wasn't wear and tear. It wasn't a flaw in the material. It was as if the image was adjusting. One of the files showed a change in shadow in relation to the central object. Another revealed an element that hadn't been there before, a dark spot in the sky, appearing in the top right-hand corner, in the same place as all the other copies. The last optical analysis carried out in 1998 brought a final observation, made by a civilian expert who never worked with military images again. These photographs are not static, they are windows stuck in paper, and something inside has gotten used to the brightness. In 1971, 3 years after the end of Operation Iron Line, 5 photographic copies of the mission, considered of uncertain value, were taken to a secure room in the underground archives of the Department of Defense in Washington. The room was lined with lead panels and kept under constant temperature and humidity surveillance. No electronic systems were allowed inside. No cables, no lenses, no screens. The images were placed on metal easels standing upright, facing the center of the room. The arrangement was not standard. It looked ceremonial. The person in charge of the installation was a lieutenant in photographic intelligence who recorded the position of each image with surgical precision. But something changed in the first month. Internal sensors began to pick up fractional pulses of heat coming from the edges of the photographs, not from the paper, but from where the paper was pointing. After this episode, the room was sealed. The report was buried under the code PINTO, an acronym that remains unexplained to this day. And the technical manager's final note simply said, "These images do not contain what was seen. They contain what is trying to be remembered." Months later, a civil servant from the microfilming department found an incomplete document among the discarded files with a confidential stamp and no signature. It was a partial transcript of a statement given by one of the Operation Iron Line cameramen. The sheet was partially torn and missing words, but the central section survived. It wasn't what we photographed. It was when. The camera didn't capture what was there. It captured what wanted to be noticed. Because before the lens turned, there was already something waiting for the right position. The document disappeared 2 days later, but the frightened employee kept a copy at home. He hand-delivered it to a journalist decades later, on condition of anonymity. The reporter who received the copy died in 2004. The sheet was never published, but it circulates among parallel archives with the title written in pen, "Image Before the Instant." In 1986, a former military photographer who took part in the mission, whose name has been kept confidential, gave an unofficial interview to a historian specializing in war archives. The man lived in isolation in a cabin on the outskirts of Colorado. He avoided cameras, mirrors, any object with a reflective surface. He wore thick curtains. He didn't turn on any lights at night. And during the conversation, he made a single request. "If this is recorded, you take it with you." During the interview, he clearly described the sequence of photos taken on the 5th day of the mission. He told how the glow that appeared in the images was not present in the real sky. He said that the photos began to react even before they were developed, and that, when he handled Roller 17, he felt a tingling sensation in his wrist that didn't go away for weeks. In the last question, the historian asked, "Do you believe that what appeared in the image was intelligent?" The photographer lowered his eyes, took a deep breath, and replied, "It wasn't just intelligent. It was something I hoped would be remembered." And the camera was the right mirror. In 2003, during a National Guard exercise in Utah, a sequence of photographs taken with thermal monitoring cameras showed a point of light suspended in the sky, motionless, with no visible source, and with the same properties documented in Operation Iron Line. No shadow, asymmetrical brightness, and distortion at the bottom edge of the image. Analysts didn't believe the coincidence. When they superimposed one of the images with a restored copy of Roll 17, they realized that the alignment of the object was identical. Same angle, same proportion in relation to the horizon line, as if the light wasn't it returning to the place, but to the instant. The investigation was closed in silence. The images archived under Gray Protocol, and among the more experienced analysts, a new term began to circulate: temporal visual echo, and a handwritten sentence in the final report: "She doesn't appear where she wants to. It appears where it was seen." Today, more than half a century after Operation Iron Line, the images classified as visual interference of undetermined origin remain sealed off any public basis. But for some independent researchers, the question was never what was recorded, but what was activated. Some believe that the phenomenon is no longer tied to the location of the mission, nor to the time it was photographed, but rather the images themselves. That each picture, each fragment revealed, functions as a reproducer of presence, capable of invoking, even partially, a consciousness trapped in a visual pattern. Not something physical, but something that observes from the inside out. And the most disturbing doubt among those still studying the case is simple and devastating. If the images reacted to the camera, what happens when someone stares back for too long?